Hello and welcome back to Inside Update, a show brought to you by InsideInvestigator.org. We are a nonprofit newsroom creating investigative journalism to root out corruption in Connecticut. My name is Connor Dragotis. I'm the managing editor here, and today I am joined by Brandon Whiting, our intrepid investigative reporter, recently returned from a trip to Europe. We're so happy to have him back. And today we're going to talk about two of his investigations. The way the timing worked out, we didn't get to talk about his homeschooling piece previously. So we're bringing that back, which is really not that old. It's, under a month still. And then we're also going to talk about E-Can-Omics, his investigation into the impact of raised bottle deposits. Let's start with homeschooling, though. Brandon, you pitched this topic, and it was, I think, as we started talking about it, other people on the team were like, oh, yeah, once you get into homeschooling, people are very, very opinionated. It's going to be a really spicy topic, I guess, for lack of a better word. Did that live up to the hype of the controversy?
Yeah, absolutely. It was funny because as I was speaking to various people for the story, I started to realize I'm like, this in it's it's almost like it's almost like guns. The issue is almost like guns rights in that there's just battle lines drawn and there is practically nobody sitting the fence on it. There's no kind of like nuanced middle for the most part. There's just this is my side, this is what I'm going to take, and nothing that you say is going to persuade me on kind of either end of the spectrum. So it was impressive in that I didn't know how just divisive the issue kind of was. So yeah.
Well, let's draw those lines. So, these two camps, it's obviously pro homeschooling and anti homeschooling, but, what are the characteristics of each of these that you uncovered in this process?
Um, well, I guess the first thing I'd want to say is, and I guess it depends on how you interpret it, but for the people who were pro homeschool regulation, I think a lot of them they did make it very clear. They're like, look, we appreciate the right to homeschool. It's just we think that in its current state, it's kind of bonkers because, they just didn't feel there was the proper controls there.
Yep.
So there was definitely some people, one source in particular I spoke with who made it very clear her thoughts on homeschooling in general, and I think it would be fair to say, yeah, she's pretty much just anti-homeschooling, but for the most part, the others that I spoke with, they were like, look, we get that it's a right, and we respect it. We just think there should be a little more, you know, less ambiguity around how parents are allowed to educate their children. Um, but basically, I mean, the the pro homeschooling side is very much, look, this is our right. I mean, it is recognized by state law, it's been recognized by the Supreme Court, and over history, like through the second half of the 20th century, their rights have really kind of only accelerated in a lot of states to where, they kind of do just have free reign to educate their kids as they see fit. And obviously, that varies a lot depending on which states you look at. Connecticut is one of those states where, if you want to homeschool your kid, I mean, this is a great state for you because you you really don't have anyone telling you what to do or how to do it. Um, and just any sort of kind of they're just very uncompromising in that, right? Any sort of if they see anyone kind of leaning towards trying to regulate things, even the tiniest a bit, or tell them what to do, they are just very adamantly against it. There was one woman I spoke with who is a homeschooling parent, and she did seem a little bit open, but she was still kind of, at the end of the day, she would rather there not be any regulations. But when I brought up certain points to her, she's like, okay, maybe that would be agreeable, but we'd have to find a way to do it without infringing on parents' rights. And that's really what the whole argument kind of hinges on. It's how do you even attempt to regulate this thing in a way that does not make parents feel like they're being infringed upon? And that's kind of the whole argument there, and that's the one thing that the two sides will seemingly never be able to agree upon.
For sure. For sure. Yeah, it's interesting, from a parental perspective. And, I think we could talk a little bit about this is, I have kids. I have opinions on homeschooling, which is a really interesting challenge. I mean, when we write about topics that are personally impactful, and I don't, you can, I won't bias it by saying where I stand on it, but I think that there's an interesting challenge from a journalist perspective and an editorial perspective to make sure that when a topic comes up that impacts your life personally or your editor's life personally or other people on the team. I think it's one of the reasons I love having an ideologically diverse team too, is we do have debates internally about hey, how do we approach a topic and make sure that we're stripping ourselves out of it, right? I mean, for me, like, I know with this one, I had multiple people look at this to make sure that I wasn't saying, "Oh, Brandon, I think this sentence should be reframed or this should be done differently." I needed those other opinions to kind of check where my head was at, so that the final product is just doing what we're supposed to be doing, providing information, providing alternative views, to inform and educate people, and I guess eventually root out corruption as well. And I think that this one was maybe less like, here's the instance of corruption, but I think on the other side of that, we want to know if there are instances in homeschooling where corruption is occurring, where abuse is occurring. That's something that I know we touched on. We had sources from I'll go on for a little bit here, cut me off, but we had sources from other states that we were like, we wanted to include stuff, but we're mission limited as a nonprofit to just do work in Connecticut. And we kind of ran into a problem that we haven't had in many investigations. I can only imagine that is frustrating as a reporter when you're trying to say, like, I want to include this, and we're kind of locked out because of the way we've structured the business. I guess the business barriers getting in the way of reporting is a really frustrating place to be.
Yeah, it's a place that's seemingly impossible not to be in one way or another. Since the beginning of reporting and only increasingly nowadays. So that is the one thing that I've appreciated about this job thus far is that, this is the first one I've ran into. Hopefully, I would like to say, hopefully it's the last one, but you can't really make or account for these things, so it is what it is. Yeah, no, I was definitely bummed when we couldn't get their voices in because, they did have some great perspective. But as for your earlier point, I mean, I it's impossible. People, I think people get this idea that as a journalist, you're supposed to be this kind of like cyborg humanoid robot where you present as a human but mentally you're more akin to like a computer, and it's just, I mean, we're humans too. We all kind of have our own backgrounds, we have our own biases, we have our own beliefs on things. And so you had your beliefs on this. I certainly walked into the story kind of with my own preconceived notions of how things may shake out. But what you have to do and what a good journalist does is you take in the information and you report it and you do your research and you try and see, if is there some validity to this? Did this person pull it out their butt? If you have the time to, obviously, on these long form stories, it's way easier to do that than say, yesterday I go down to the Capitol and I'm hearing a bunch of people speak for 2 hours and it's like, okay, I need to drive back 45 minutes and get this story in within like an hour and a half. Clearly I don't have the time, even though, hey, to give myself a pat on the back, I did provide links to all the statistics that they had cited. So woohoo. But yeah, I mean, I think your job as a reporter is really just to you can have these preconceived notions, you can have these ideas of how things may shake out, and a lot of the time your gut instinct will be right, and a lot of the time it won't be, and you'll be surprised, and either the story will take you in a direction that you totally did not anticipate it when you started it, or people will present information to you that will make you kind of consider where they're coming from and thinking, okay, I see why they're thinking this, why they're feeling this, and you'll get information that'll kind of surprise you and shake your own preconceived notions. And I think with a lot of issues, people kind of there's kind of this conflicting schools of thought in journalism where it's either, screw looking impartial, the truth is the truth. If it's raining outside and you look out the window and one person says it's raining, the other person says it's sunny, it's your job to say it's raining. And I would agree with that. But with issues like these, it does they're very opinionated, and there is kind of a gray area in the best way to proceed. So I tried to really kind of put it out there like, look, there is no regulation of homeschooling here in Connecticut. You can think about that as you may. I'll present to you the thoughts of those who are gung ho about that and the thoughts of people who are like, let's pump the brakes. There has been reported abuse and neglect, and that has occurred in states both with strong regulation and without it. I mean, that's a fact. I'll present it to you. I'll present the research done by the CRHE, the Coalition for Responsible Home Education. You could think it's a load of bogus or not. You could disagree with their mission statement or not. That's up to you. And I will present to you, the arguments made by the pro homeschooling advocates who say, look, bad things happen to kids no matter who's looking over them and no matter what regulation is in place, it continues to happen. And who really had a lot to say about the public education system here in Connecticut. And they presented their facts there. And, you can agree with them, you can disagree with them. So that was more so a story where it's like, okay, I'd have to write a research paper if I wanted to kind of provide my own like version of the truth, either that or an opinion piece. So, I tried to do the best with the hand that I was being dealt there, and hopefully we succeeded.
This is one of the reasons that I love working with you is because you don't shy away from those questions. And I mean, I think everyone who's watching and listening to this deserves to know, like from the very first time that we spoke with you in like the interview process, even, I think, we started asking questions like, hey, what's the proper role of journalism? And you were a candidate who actually thought about it and articulated it and then came back with additional thoughts. I mean, the way that you approach this job is, I think, vital to our success, but also just so indicative of good journalism because you're not writing for a particular agenda or just to make a particular end. You're a deep thinker. Like, I really respect that about you. And also your lack of fear to take on controversial topics. I mean, I don't see this being the last piece that you write that gets people a little fired up, both in the interview process and then after it is published. And you shouldn't be, right? That's why we exist. We exist to root out corruption. So we can't shy away from crazy topics and controversial things because that's oftentimes where the corruption is. We have to push on that. So I won't hammer the compliments on this broadcast too much more here, but you deserve it. And I think that's one of the things I love about this job and about this team is we get to do this day in and day out because it makes a difference. Truly, truly. So, do you have other thoughts on the homeschooling debate investigation? Otherwise, I just don't want to shortchange E-Can-Omics because this opens a whole different can of worms about you meeting people who are living their life in some really interesting ways.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about this for a full 2 hours. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, we gotta call it quits eventually. But thank you for all of that. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's move on then to E-Can-Omics. And E-Can-Omics is an investigation about the impact of raised deposits. So there's a few things. If we could share a little bit about what the heck actually happened, and then I want to ask you about the people. So can you just talk a little bit about why you wrote this? What's the legal change that led you down this path?
Well, first I got to give credit where credit is due. It was Mark's idea for the story, and he was like, "Have it," because I don't have the time to do it. And I was like, "Perfect," because everything else I'm working on is falling to pieces. So shouts out to Mark. But yeah, the idea for the story was kind of trying to see what sectors of the economy were impacted kind of the most by this raised deposit. So who's benefiting from this money? Is the state getting more money in essence now that the deposit has been doubled, or has now because the incentive is so much stronger for people to return it, is it kind of swinging back to the consumers? And of the consumers who do return these bottles, what do they typically spend it on? Um, so it's an interesting idea for a story, and I don't know exactly if I could provide any sort of empirical answer. I think it's a pretty lofty question. And I was realizing that as I was writing it up, I was like, this is kind of a crapshoot. I don't know how
Sure.
that I can best answer where people are spending their money. But we did get numbers from the state just to see how it would be impacting their bottom line. So that's a question that I think, we answered pretty well. But the other element of it definitely was kind of human interest. Just seeing, what do people spend their money on, especially people who really make a habit out of collecting cans and bottles. And as I was speaking to her name is escaping me right now, but the head of the Container Recycling Institute, who was very instrumental in kind of advising this law as it was being written up. I mean,
Susan Collins.
yeah, Susan Collins. Susan Collins is like a human encyclopedia. I was super impressed. I mean, as I was talking to her about this, she just starts pulling out the names of studies and the professors who study. And here I am forgetting her name. I'm terrible. But pulling out the names of studies and the professors who studied them and their findings from like 10, 15 years ago. And I'm just like, are you just able to cite this off the top of your head? She's like, oh no, don't worry. It's literally my job. I'm like, well, you're very good at it. And she had shown me a study which said basically the people who benefit the most from these are people who have very low incomes, people who are either at poverty level or possibly even teetering below it, because the supplemental income that can be provided by, a couple days a week or just a couple hours a day every day collecting cans, I mean, the percentage of their income is much higher. So, if you're making $100,000 a year and you make $500 a week collecting cans, that's a much smaller percent of your base income that you're supplementing with those cans than say someone who's, making only 15,000 a year and making 500 a week off of those cans. And so the incentive is really the strongest for people who have the least. So, I wasn't going around asking people, hey, what's your income level? Because that's just a non-starter. And, as journalists, we don't want to be in the business of assumptions either. But, you could, there was, as I'm sitting around either the bottle return centers or, just you see it, it makes sense. It's definitely it's a really good incentive not only for the state to kind of clean up its streets and meet its recycling goals, but it's also just helpful from an economic perspective for people who, maybe don't have many means otherwise. And also just for bottle redemption centers alone, if you want to get into the recycling business, this was a great bill for you. I mean, I think the state had confirmed that there was 5 or 6 centers that had opened since the bill had passed, and they even told me, this isn't an exhaustive list. So it could be even more, since the list was last updated. So yeah, that's kind of where I stand on it. I don't know, big long rant ended.
Well, with the 30,000 foot view, I love that you just touched on something. I feel like, part of the reason that we do this show is a little bit to pull back the curtain on journalism, because otherwise, it can be a little bit of a black box. And this is a particularly interesting investigation because you were going to people who were in the industry who were being impacted. You were talking about research papers. And then you're also like man on the street. Like this investigation opens with, as I understand it, you're sitting outside a bottle redemption center and you're basically doing cold handshakes with strangers saying like, hey, I just happened to be sitting here as you're walking up. But that ended up being a beautiful vehicle to talk about the whole thing. And I don't even know if there's too much to talk about here, but I did think that it was interesting that this investigation pulled in so many different types of sources. And I am curious to know, like, what is that like? just you walking up to strangers, with your notepad ready and, hey, can I record you? Were people responsive to that generally?
It's always a little nerve-wracking. You never know how people are going to take it. I mean, I think some people, it's like they've been waiting their whole life for this moment, and you thinking as the interviewer, you're like, oh, well, happy someone's this happy for this right now. And then on the other spectrum of things, there's people who it's like, I'm not a cop. I don't have a wire on me. I don't need to take your picture if you don't want me to. I mean, and so there was definitely a bit of wariness with the people on the street that I approached with this subject. Most of them didn't want to give me their last names. I'm just like, okay, sure.
Yep.
And or ages too. And that's fine. We work with what we got. So yeah, it's always a little, you get a little gun shy as a journalist, I would say. Even it's funny because I tell people this all the time, people who know me in my personal life, they're like, "Oh, well, you should be great at reporting because you're such a social, outgoing person. You can just strike up a conversation with people." And it's like, you would think that, but when it's your job to do it, that's when it's like my brain just shuts off, I have to like pinch myself, like, okay, I have to go up, I have to approach, I got to give myself like a pep talk before phone calls, before approaching, legislators, before approaching random people on the street. So it's kind of funny how that works out. But at the end of the day, I mean, people are people. If they want to talk to you, they'll talk to you. If they don't want to talk to you, they will not talk to you, or they'll have some choice words that let you know they don't want to talk to you. So, you get it's a muscle that you have to exercise. So doing stories like these where you're kind of just, man on the ground, I mean, it's always nice to shake off the cobwebs every now and again.
Yeah.
But as for the other levels of communication, to be honest with you, if I had known some of the difficulties I may have had later on in the story, just going back and forth with I guess I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but certain other sources in the story that there was some difficulties, I'd take the man on the street interviews 10 out of 10 times over having to wait back and like, okay, is this right? Is that not right? Yeah, like I said, I don't want to throw anybody out there, and I understand the topic they were dealing with was kind of complicated and
Yeah.
whatnot. But
But
yeah,
it
so
happens. I
all
mean,
in
that's
all,
the
not
the
that
human
bad.
element, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
of journalism, we are interacting with real human beings every single day. I mean, I was talking, so we have obviously our newest investigative reporter, Alex. We were chatting yesterday, and she was telling me a story about how she had been thrown out of a meeting inappropriately, or when you show up and people are really surprised that they have a reporter knocking on their door, just some of the circumstances that it's not a job without risk, but it's also a job that does force you to push those boundaries a little bit in the pursuit of truth. So yeah, making sure that muscle's strong can really make a difference. Um, I don't know. We've thought about even, undercover work as well. We get some tips that really put us in a position to ask some very challenging questions. And far from pushing people away, if anything, I think it's important that people know that we are willing to flex that muscle. We are willing to ask the questions that other people aren't or can't. You talked about the amount of time it takes to put together an investigation for versus a daily piece, right? We are set up in such a way to give you space. Not as much as we would like, of course. Don't get me wrong. I wish that we had all the time in the world, but giving you the ability to put together 2,500 to what was your Where's Barry story? 10,000 words, right? Like we that's a challenge. We got to figure out what works and what doesn't work. But credit to you and everyone on this team for putting in the work to make that a reality. It's not an easy one. So. What else are you looking for tips on? Is there anything that you're looking for people to reach out on? I know we would love to get more thoughts on homeschooling too, educational experiences, stuff that's in the state of Connecticut, good, bad, or otherwise. Please reach out to tips@insideinvestigator.org. Any other topics that you wish you had more people speaking up about?
Shoot, Great question. It's a great question. Honestly, I was thinking though, after just the meeting I had went to yesterday on Medicare Advantage. I mean, it seems like if that's such a big problem and people have had so many issues with it getting their experience, I think that could make for a great long form piece. I guess we're ending the podcast with me pitching to you an investigation that may or may not happen. Sorry to put you on the spot, but
Uh,
yeah, I think that would be a good one to get people's voices because I'm sure, they had shared numerous stories there. I'm sure we could find numerous more, unfortunately. So yeah, I guess off the top of my head, that would be a good one.
Well, as always, the best way to get a hold of our team is tips@insideinvestigator.org. Brandon, thank you for taking the time today to chat about this. Two great pieces. Obviously, we're talking kind of pulling back the curtain here. Go to insideinvestigator.org, though, and read these things. If you are watching, listening, tuning in, we're now on radio, Amazon TV, Apple TV. We're all over the place. The show is growing. It's wonderful. Please head over to insideinvestigator.org. I'll also throw out there, we're a nonprofit. So everything we do is driven and supported by readers who donate to support our work, which you can also do on our website. So I'll wrap up there then. Brandon, thank you. You rock. I'm really looking forward to the next investigations here. And to everyone tuning in, thank you for reading, watching, and supporting. We'll be back in 2 weeks. And until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.